The summons arrived on a Tuesday, which David had always considered the most bureaucratically honest day of the week, not pretending to be important like Monday, not coasting toward relief like Friday. Just Tuesday, doing its job. The message came through the palace's internal network, a single line of text on his communicator that read, "The Queen requests your presence in the private garden at the 14th hour." No elaboration, no stated reason. The kind of message that was itself the message. He read it 3 times standing in the corridor outside the cartography department, where he had spent the morning reviewing stellar navigation charts for the Queen's upcoming diplomatic voyage to the Verandal system. A junior analyst named Petra had been watching him from her desk, with the particular attentiveness of someone who has learned that the senior staff's expressions are a more reliable forecast than official bulletins. When he looked up from his communicator, she immediately became very interested in her charts. David had served in the court of Queen Camila for 6 years. In that time, he had developed a reasonably precise understanding of the palace's various grammars. The formal summons to the throne room, which meant public business conducted with appropriate ceremony. The call to the War Council chamber, which meant something had gone wrong somewhere in the outer systems. The invitation to the state dining hall, which meant an alliance needed performed warmth. The private garden meant none of these things. The private garden meant the Queen wanted no official record, no attendants taking careful notes, no protocol to hide behind. In 6 years, he had been summoned there exactly twice. Both times had been significant. This was the 3rd time, and he had a specific, unhelpful suspicion about why. He put the communicator in his pocket and walked back to his desk with the careful steadiness of a man who is absolutely not thinking about anything in particular. The garden occupied the eastern wing of the palace's upper tier, a pressurized terrace open to the sky of Elaris IV, a planet whose afternoons produced a quality of golden amber light that the original architects had clearly understood and designed around. Real soil, real water, plants imported from a dozen systems arranged with the kind of effortless precision that takes decades and significant funding to achieve. David arrived at the 14th hour and 15 seconds, because punctuality in small things was one of the few forms of control available to him at present. The Queen was standing at the far end of the garden with her back to him. This was, he understood immediately, intentional. Camilla did not do things by accident. She was dressed without formal insignia, a deep blue that caught the amber light in a way that suggested someone had thought carefully about the color, and her dark hair was unbound, falling past her shoulders. Her ears, longer than a human's and gently tapered, caught the light at their edges. He had spent considerable professional energy over the years not noticing her ears. He acknowledged internally, not always successful. He stopped at the appropriate distance and waited. A small automated pollinator drone drifted past him, paused as if considering his situation and moved on. He envied it. She let the silence exist for a long moment before she turned. Her golden skin was warm in the afternoon light, and her expression was the one he had privately catalogued as *composed directness. The face she used when she had already done the work of deciding something and was now simply executing it. She looked at him the way people look at things they have been thinking about for longer than they intended. She did not ask him to confirm anything. She said, "You've been reviewing the Verandal charts this morning." "Yes," he said, because it was true, and because starting with the manageable facts seemed wise. "Are they accurate? Within acceptable variance? The 3rd navigation point will need recalculating closer to departure, given the current position of the system's outer body." She nodded slowly. There was a pause. The pollinator drone returned, hovered briefly near a blue flowering plant to David's left and departed again. He was beginning to feel a professional kinship with it. "I've been thinking," the Queen said, with the careful, unhurried quality of someone who has been thinking for exactly 3 days and has organized those thoughts into a structure, "about the nature of attention. David said nothing. Specifically, she continued, taking a single unhurried step along the garden path, the kind that accumulates, not announced, not deliberate perhaps, simply present, consistently. She glanced at him with something that was not quite a question. "You understand what I mean?" He did. He understood with great clarity and moderate despair. "I believe," he said, after a moment that lasted approximately the length of a small geological era, "that I may have been somewhat legible." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, something that lived near a smile and occasionally borrowed its furniture. "Somewhat," she agreed. The thing about accumulation, David reflected, was that it never felt like accumulation while it was happening. It felt like individual moments, each one reasonable and explicable on its own terms, each one defensible in isolation. It was only when you laid them end to end and stood back that the shape of the thing became visible. And by then, of course, it was considerably too late to have an opinion about it. He had reached for her chair before she asked. That had been 18 months ago, a minor gesture at the end of a long briefing session when she had been visibly tired, and the chair was slightly too far from the table and his hand had simply moved. She had sat down without comment. He had returned to his position at the wall with the serene expression of a man who had not just done something he was going to think about later. He had thought about it for approximately 6 weeks. There had been the incident during the Velhari Trade Summit, when an ambassador from the outer colonies had said something dismissive about Elarian customs in a tone that was technically within diplomatic bounds and practically outside them. David had been standing 3 meters away. He had not moved, had not spoken, had maintained exactly the correct professional stillness, but something in his expression had apparently communicated itself across the room, because the ambassador had inexplicably revised his tone mid-sentence and finished the statement more carefully. Camila had not looked at David afterward, but her ears had tilted, very slightly, in his direction. He had catalogued this under asterisk coincidence and left it there. Then there was the matter of the Botanical Survey report. This one he was less proud of. The Queen had mentioned, in passing, during a routine briefing about the Elaris IV conservation zones, that she found the native Sorali blossom interesting, not scientifically, but aesthetically, the way it opened only during the amber hours of afternoon. It was a single sentence. An aside. He had filed a formal request with the Palace Botanical Archive 2 days later for a full research summary on the Sorali blossom's flowering behavior, light sensitivity, and recorded history in Illyrian cultural tradition. The archive had sent back 47 pages. He had read all 47 pages. He had no operational reason to have done this. When he had encountered the relevant conservation officer in a corridor the following week, the man had asked with genuine curiosity what the strategic interest in flowering plants was. David had said it was classified. It was not classified. Standing now in the garden with the afternoon light making everything unreasonably picturesque, he became aware that Camila was watching him with the patient expression of someone who has correctly identified that the other person is currently conducting an internal audit. "You're cataloging," she said. "I'm reflecting," he said with dignity, "on how legible you've been, on the nature of professional attentiveness." She tilted her head, and the light caught the edge of one long ear. "Is that what we're calling it?" It was not strictly a question. He appreciated that she had framed it as one anyway. It was generous of her. He had worked with Camila for 6 years across 3 different political crises. One attempted coup that had been resolved before it fully committed to its own premise, and a diplomatic incident involving a misclassified cargo shipment that had accidentally carried 200 live specimens of a species the Varandal considered sacred. In that time he had formed a precise and thoroughly inconvenient understanding of her. The specific quality of her silences, the way her thinking showed in the slight movement of her ears before her expression caught up, the distinction between the laugh she performed for state functions and the quieter, more unguarded one that appeared when something struck her as genuinely absurd. He knew the second laugh better than he had any professional justification for. The pollinator drone made another pass. David was beginning to suspect the palace's automated systems were not entirely neutral parties. "The Velhari summit," he said, because apparently he was confessing things now. When Ambassador Thresh revised his statement, "I noticed that. I was concerned you might. I noticed it at the time," she said. "I've simply been patient." The particular quality of this, the information that she had been carrying this knowledge for what sounded like considerably longer than 3 days, that the 3 days had been specifically about something else, settled over him with the gentle weight of a structural revelation. He recalibrated several assumptions in rapid succession. "How long," he said carefully, "have you been patient?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Along the garden path, a small ornamental light fixture activated prematurely as the afternoon shifted, the palace environmental systems misreading the cloud cover, a minor error that happened occasionally. It blinked once, uncertainly, then committed. "Long enough," she said, "that I stopped being surprised by it and began being curious about something else entirely." He waited. "I began to be curious," she said, with the composed precision of someone choosing each word from a carefully arranged selection, "about what I intended to do with the information." The ambient hum of the palace's climate system moved through the garden. Somewhere in the deeper beds, an automated irrigation line clicked on and then, after a moment of apparent reconsideration, clicked off again. Even the infrastructure, David thought, seemed to be holding its breath. She began to walk. This was, David had learned over 6 years, one of Camilla's primary thinking mechanisms. Not pacing implied agitation, and she was not agitated. Walking, specifically, with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has decided that the conversation will travel with her and can either keep up or wait by the gate. He fell into step at the appropriate distance, which was, as he was acutely aware, the distance that had contributed to this situation in the first place. Too consistent, too calibrated. The kind of distance that, if you measured it across 6 years of corridors and briefing rooms and state functions, would produce a very precise and very damning data set. The garden path curved gently along the eastern edge of the terrace, where the transparent barrier gave way to the open sky of Elaris IV. The afternoon was deepening, the amber light shifting toward something richer, and the automated systems were beginning their slow adjustment. Subtle changes in the terrace's internal temperature, the irrigation lines cycling in the background, a distant soft chime from the palace's chronological network marking the quarter hour. The ordinary machinery of the day, continuing its work with complete indifference to what was happening inside it. "I want to ask you something," Camila said, "and I want you to answer it without first deciding what the correct answer is." David considered pointing out that this was an extremely difficult condition to meet, given that deciding what the correct answer was happened to be his primary professional skill. He decided against it. He was, perhaps, developing judgment. "I'll try," he said. "Did you believe I wouldn't notice?" He opened his mouth, closed it. The honest answer was arranging itself with some reluctance in the front of his mind, nudging aside several more comfortable alternatives. The honest answer was that he had not precisely believed she wouldn't notice. He had believed, with the particular motivated reasoning of someone who has made a decision they haven't fully admitted to themselves, that noticing and acting on the knowledge were 2 different things, and that a queen had sufficient other considerations to occupy her attention indefinitely. "I believed," he said with care, "that you had more important things to do than arrive at a conclusion." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a remarkable piece of logic. I'm aware that you essentially decided that I was too busy to think." "I decided," he said, with what remained of his dignity, "that the subject matter was unlikely to rise to the level requiring your direct attention." And yet, she said, gesturing at the garden around them with a small, precise movement that encompassed the terrace, the afternoon, and the entire conversation. Here we are. Here we are, he agreed. She stopped walking. They had reached the section of the garden where the sorali blossoms grew. He recognized them immediately, and with a specific internal exhaustion, because of course she had stopped here, because the universe had apparently decided that this conversation required visual aids. The flowers were open, predictably, in the amber afternoon light, their pale blue petals arranged in the documented radial pattern he had read about across 47 pages of botanical archive material that he had absolutely no strategic reason to have requested. Camilla looked at the flowers, then she looked at him, then she looked at the flowers again. The archive report, she said. I can explain that. Can you? He said and paused, and made one final attempt at a defensible framing, developing a comprehensive understanding of the palace's natural environment for potential security assessment purposes. The silence that followed was the specific kind that has its own weight and texture. Security, she said. Botanical security is an underexplored field. David. Yes, you read 47 pages about flowers. They were very thorough pages. Something happened in her expression then, a small fracture in the composed directness, something moving beneath it that she did not entirely suppress. It was not the state function laugh. It was closer to the other one, the one he knew better than he should, and hearing it now under these particular circumstances produced in him a sensation that his internal systems had no clean category for and simply filed under asterisk significant. She pressed one hand briefly over her mouth, gathered herself, looked at him with eyes that were still warm with it. I have, she said, once she had fully recovered the architecture of her composure, conducted diplomatic negotiations with 7 sovereign systems. I have managed a succession crisis, 2 contested treaties, and an incident involving 200 sacred animals in a cargo container. She paused. None of those situations involved a security assessment of flowers. To be fair, he said, the sacred animal incident had some botanical components. It did not. There was a plant-based sedative involved in the original containment protocol. She stared at him. He was fairly certain this was the first time in 6 years he had made her genuinely speechless, which he would have found more satisfying under different circumstances. The pollinator drone drifted past at this precise moment, moving between them with the calm purposefulness of a small mechanical creature that had absolutely no idea what it had just flown through. They both watched it go. Then Camilla said with great restraint, "You are very strange." "I've been told," he said. "By whom?" "Mostly myself." She began walking again. David fell into step beside her, not at the careful professional distance this time, but slightly closer, in the way that happens when a conversation has moved past a certain point, and the previous geometry no longer quite applies. Neither of them acknowledged this. It seemed like the sensible approach. The garden path continued along the terrace's inner edge, past a cluster of imported verandal silvergrass that caught the deepening afternoon light and held it in thin, luminous blades. The palace's environmental systems had completed their adjustment, and the temperature on the terrace had settled into something comfortable and deliberate, the kind of engineered pleasantness that reminded David, occasionally, that almost nothing about this world was accidental. Even the air had been decided by someone. "I want to tell you something," Camilla said, with the particular quality she used when the thing she was about to say had been sitting with her for long enough to have developed patience of its own. "About the 3 days." He listened. "It wasn't the fact of it," she said. "I want to be precise about that. When the information came to me, and it came the way things always come in a palace, not dramatically, just as the accumulated weight of small observations that someone finally thought to mention, I sat with it, and the thing that occupied me was not the fact itself." She paused. "It was that it hadn't landed on me the way I expected it to." The silvergrass moved in the climate-controlled air. Somewhere below the terrace, the palace's deep infrastructure hummed its continuous note, the sound of a building maintaining itself. "How had you expected it to land?" David said. "As a complication," she said. "A political variable, something requiring management." She considered the path ahead of them. "That is how these things usually arrive. Someone in my position develops a reliable taxonomy for this kind of information. You receive it, you assess the implications, you determine the appropriate response. The process is familiar." "But," David said, because there was clearly a but, and he had spent 6 years learning to identify the precise moment before she arrived at one. "But it didn't feel like a variable," she said. It felt like she stopped, not because she didn't have the word he understood, but because she was choosing whether to use it. Her ears shifted slightly, the tell he had catalogued long ago, the one that appeared when her thinking moved ahead of her speech. It felt like information I had been waiting to have confirmed. The afternoon held this. David's mind, which was professionally trained to process complex information and produce measured responses under pressure, produced nothing whatsoever for approximately 4 seconds. This was, in his experience, unprecedented. "That is," he said finally, "a significant thing to say." "Yes," she agreed. "I'm aware." She said it with the dry composure of someone who has made a considered decision to say a significant thing and is not going to pretend otherwise. "I spent 3 days determining whether I was going to say it. I've determined that I am." He thought about the 6 years, the briefings and the corridors and the councils, and the way he had maintained, at all times, the correct professional configuration, the precise distance, the appropriate attentiveness, the careful management of everything he had noticed and continued to notice about her, filed under categories that became increasingly unconvincing over time. He thought about the chair 18 months ago, the Velhari ambassador, the 47 pages. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him not unkindly. "For which part?" "For being," he said, under the apparent impression that competent concealment was the same as considerate behavior. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a reasonably honest assessment. I had a lot of time to prepare it." "When?" "The walk here," he said, "and the 6 years before that." The corner of her mouth moved again, the same motion from earlier, the thing that lived near a smile. It stayed longer this time. The path brought them to a small open section of the terrace, where a low ornamental structure held a series of objects that the palace's Cultural Preservation Office had classified as decorative artifacts from the early Illyrian settlement period. Among them, on a narrow ledge, sat a small ceramic bird, hand-formed, slightly asymmetrical, with the particular imperfection of something made before manufacturing precision was available. David had passed it on his 2 previous visits to the garden, and had noted it both times without incident. He gestured while speaking, making a point about the taxonomy of poor decisions, and the back of his hand connected with the ceramic bird with a clean, definitive contact. It left the ledge. They both watched it describe a small arc through the engineered air of the terrace and land on the garden path with a sound that was somehow both quiet and extremely loud. It did not break. It rolled, with extraordinary composure, approximately 40 centimeters along the path, and came to rest against the base of a verandal silvergrass cluster, where it sat looking no more or less dignified than it had on the ledge. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then Camila made a sound he had never heard from her in 6 years of service. A short, genuine, completely unguarded sound that was unambiguously a laugh, arrived at without permission or preparation. She looked at the bird. She looked at him. She appeared to be conducting a brief internal effort to restore appropriate composure and concluding, apparently, that it was not worth the effort. "Botanical security," she said. "I stand by the field," he said. She laughed again, and this time she let it exist without managing it at all. David picked up the ceramic bird. This seemed like the right thing to do, a small, concrete action available to him while the larger, less concrete things arranged themselves. He examined it briefly. It was unharmed, which struck him as slightly unfair given how comprehensively everything else in the garden had been disrupted. He set it back on the ledge with perhaps more care than strictly necessary, aligning it with the same orientation it had occupied before, and turned to find Camila watching him with an expression that was still warm from the laugh, and had not yet fully returned to its official configuration. This was new territory. In 6 years he had seen her composed, focused, diplomatically warm, carefully neutral, and occasionally, in the specific exhaustion that follows a long council session, simply tired. He had not, until the last several minutes, seen her unguarded in quite this way. It was considerably more difficult to be in the same space as, and he was aware that this was not a complaint. "You put it back in exactly the same position," she said. "Habit," he said, "of restoring things you've displaced." He looked at her. She looked at him. The amber light had deepened another increment, the palace's exterior sensors making their continuous quiet calculations about the angle and quality of available light, adjusting the terrace barrier's tint by fractions. "That," he said, "is a fair characterization." She turned and continued along the path, and he walked with her, and the distance between them was what it was. The garden's automated systems cycled softly around them. The distant click of irrigation, the low hum of the climate regulators embedded in the terrace floor, the occasional passage of the pollinator, drone executing its programmed rounds with the serene purposefulness of something that had only one job and found it sufficient. David had developed over the course of this afternoon a genuine respect for the drone. It knew exactly what it was doing and why. He envied this. "I want to ask you something else," Camila said, "and I want the same condition to apply." No deciding what the correct answer is first. "Yes." He braced himself internally, which he hoped did not show externally, though he was increasingly aware that his external presentation was less reliable than he had previously believed. "All right. When you decided," she paused, choosing the construction carefully, "that I was too occupied to arrive at a conclusion, was that entirely about my schedule? Or was some portion of it about what you thought the conclusion would be?" The honest answer did not require as much excavation as the previous one. It was closer to the surface, which made it both easier and worse to retrieve. "The second one," he said, "primarily." She nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected, which it almost certainly did. "You assumed an outcome." "I assumed the most professionally reasonable outcome," he said, "which was that the information, if it arrived, would be received as a complication requiring management, and managed accordingly." "Yes." "Meaning," she said, with the precision of someone who intends to complete the logic fully, "that you had already arrived at the conclusion yourself, on my behalf, and determined it was unfavorable, and organized your behavior around that determination. Without asking." There was a long pause during which David considered the efficiency with which she had just disassembled 6 years of motivated reasoning, and laid the components out on the garden path in plain view. He had briefed senior diplomatic officials. He had navigated 3 political crises. He had once talked a delegation of Verandal trade representatives down from a formal grievance using only a misattributed historical quotation and considerable confidence. None of this had prepared him for the experience of being correctly understood by someone who had clearly been paying attention longer than he had. "Yes," he said. "That was presumptuous of you," she said. "It was," he agreed. "You decided what I would think without consulting me." "I did. About myself. Also about you, yes." She looked at him sideways, and there was something in the look that was both critical and, underneath the criticism, something else. Something that had the texture of a door standing open that had previously been closed. "You're very good at managing outcomes," she said. "You're considerably less good at allowing them to occur naturally." "In my defense," he said, Natural outcomes in a palace environment are rarely natural. That's true, she conceded. But we are not in the palace, we are in the garden. This distinction, delivered with complete simplicity, settled over him with the particular quality of a statement that means precisely what it says, and also significantly more. The garden was the queen's choice. The absence of attendance was her choice. The specific grammar of this summons, which he had understood from the first reading of that single line of text on a Tuesday morning, had been her construction from the beginning. She had built this space deliberately, and she was telling him, in the clearest possible terms available to a woman of her position, that what happened inside it was subject to different rules. He stopped walking. She stopped a half step after, and turned to look at him with the patient directness of someone who has been waiting for him to catch up to a particular moment, and is pleased but not surprised that he has finally arrived. "I made an error," he said, "a significant one. I treated a question as already answered when it hadn't been asked." "Yes," she said, "I'd like to ask it." The afternoon sat around them. The pollinator drone made one final pass through the sorali blossoms, completed its circuit, and returned to its docking station somewhere along the terrace wall with the quiet satisfaction of work concluded. The palace hummed. The light held. "You may," said Camilla. He asked it without words. This was, he understood even as it happened, either the most honest thing he had ever done or the least professionally defensible, and he had arrived at a point in the afternoon where the distinction no longer seemed as important as it once had. He simply looked at her, without the careful management, without the correct professional distance, without the 6 years of accumulated architecture he had built around the thing to keep it from being visible. He looked at her the way he had been not looking at her for a very long time, and let it exist in the open air between them without apology or qualification. Camilla received this with the composed directness that was native to her, and then, gradually, with something else, something that moved through her expression the way the amber light moved through the verandal silvergrass, not dramatically, but completely. Her ears tilted, the small involuntary tell he had catalogued long ago, and she did not correct it. She let that exist too. "I see," she said quietly. "I imagine you do," he said. "You've been seeing it for some time." "Longer than 3 days," she confirmed. "How much longer?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, and the specific quality of her pause told him the answer before she gave it. "Long enough," she said, "that I had already asked myself the question you just asked, and arrived at an answer, and then spent a considerable amount of time being irritated that you hadn't asked it yet." David absorbed this. The full shape of the last 6 years rearranged itself quietly in his understanding. Every corridor, every briefing, every carefully maintained distance. And he saw it now from the other side. And the view from the other side was both illuminating and faintly humiliating. "I owe you a more substantial apology than the previous one," he said. "You owe me," she said, with the dry precision that was one of the things he had spent 6 years not admitting he loved. Approximately 4 years of apology, if we are being accurate about the timeline. 4 years, possibly 4.5. He looked at her. "You've been waiting 4.5 years for me to ask a question I had already answered incorrectly on your behalf." "Yes." "That," he said, "is an extraordinary amount of patience." "I'm a queen," she said. "Patience is a professional requirement. Though I will say," she added, with the particular composure of someone delivering a verdict they have been saving, "that you made it considerably more difficult than necessary." The Botanical Archive report alone added at least 3 months. The report was thorough. It was 47 pages about flowers, David. 47 very informative pages. Something moved through her expression again, the warmth that had appeared with the laugh and never entirely retreated, settling now into something quieter and more permanent. She took one step toward him, which in the specific grammar of everything they had established in this garden, and across 6 years of careful distances, was not a small thing. It was, in its way, the clearest sentence she had spoken all afternoon. He closed the remaining distance because he had spent long enough on the wrong side of it. The palace hummed around them. The climate systems maintained their precise calibrations. Somewhere along the terrace wall, the pollinator drone sat in its docking station, its work complete, its small mechanical conscience entirely clear. The sorali blossoms held their position in the amber light, doing what they had always done, indifferent to documentation. They stood close enough that he could see the faint light along the edge of her ear, and he thought, with the specific clarity that arrives when something long complicated becomes suddenly simple, that he would not be filing any further research requests about it. He knew enough. He knew considerably more than enough. He had, it turned out, always known. "There is a practical matter," Camila said, after a moment that had its own complete and unhurried shape. "There are several," he said. "The court will notice." "The court," he said, "has apparently already noticed. If the information reached you through accumulated observation, it began somewhere." She acknowledged this with a slight inclination of her head. "Petra," she said. He stared, the junior analyst. She mentioned, in the context of a completely unrelated conversation about the Verandal charts, that you had read the message 3 times in the corridor, and then spent the rest of the morning being very calm about it. Camilla's expression carried the faint satisfaction of someone who has held this information and enjoyed holding it. She said, and I am quoting precisely, that you had the look of a man whose Tuesday had developed opinions. David considered this for a long moment. "I'm going to need to review our departmental observation protocols." "You trained her yourself," Camila said. "I'm beginning to regret the thoroughness." She smiled fully, without managing it, the real one, the one he knew, and the afternoon held it, and the garden held it, and he understood that this was the thing that had been waiting at the end of the long trajectory of small accumulated moments. Not a declaration made in formal chambers, not a political variable assessed and managed, but this. 2 people standing in a garden on a planet whose afternoons were the color of something worth staying for, having finally said the true thing. He walked back through the palace an hour later along the same corridors he had walked coming in. The same guards stood at their posts. Petra was still at her desk when he passed the cartography department, and she looked up with the expression of someone exercising considerable professional restraint. "The Verandal charts," he said without stopping. "Third navigation point still needs recalculating," she said with perfect composure. "See to it," he said. He continued down the corridor, and the palace continued its work around him, and everything was exactly as it had been that morning, and he walked through it changed in the way that only happens when something long true is finally spoken aloud. Not transformed, not resolved into sudden simplicity, but settled. Grounded, like a navigation point correctly calculated at last, after a long voyage that had known, somewhere in its instruments, the destination all along. Behind him in the cartography department, he heard Petra make a very small sound that was almost certainly not a laugh. Almost certainly,